He has been at the center of intense mediation efforts between Russia and Ukraine. Barely a week ago, he managed to bring together in his native Antalya the foreign ministers of these two countries in a meeting that he chaired, a tripartite meeting with them. His country, a NATO member, is possibly in a unique position to mediate in this conflict. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu and CNBC's Hadley Gamble. Welcome to you both.
Your Excellency, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome. Of course, my name is Hadley Gamble. I am CNBC's Chief International Correspondent and anchor based in Abu Dhabi, and I'm thrilled to be here at the Doha Forum and speaking to the gentleman beside me. Your Excellency, just to kick things off, I was on side in Antalya for the first meeting of the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine. I spoke directly with Sergei Lavrov, as I did exclusively with the Ukrainian foreign minister. And the takeaway from the talks seemed to be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's great that we're talking, but we're not getting anywhere yet. And we know that the conflict is not going well for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Is there a way to get a face-saving exit soon?
First, thank you very much for this question, and let me thank our host, Qatar, for inviting us Doha Forum. And to answer your question, it's a difficult question, but we have to find a face-saving way out or honorable exit for both sides, and they can sell publicly and globally. And at the beginning, we did our best to prevent this war. My President Erdogan spent a lot of efforts, and I was in touch with my colleagues on both sides. And of course, there are different channels. It was important to bring two foreign ministers at that level. I mean, the two countries at that level was important, symbolic, and the expectation was not very high. And you know, there is another track, Belarusian track, and there is also a channel or back channel between presidents. And as the international community, we should continue pressure on particularly the aggressor, which is Russia, and then their aggression on Ukraine's sovereignty is unacceptable. And that's, at the same time, we should help both sides to find this face-saving way out. So, and there is a back channel between two presidents, as far as I know. I don't want to go into the details of this process. So it seems that they have been negotiating serious issues, serious items. Probably everybody knows all these 6 items. And so I hope at the end they can agree and we can have ceasefire. But meanwhile, we need urgent humanitarian ceasefire, particularly in Mariupol and the other areas that they have been fighting, and to evacuate the people. So we need to open humanitarian corridor as well. So there is a still chance, there is a still hope, but we have to continue our efforts.
And in terms of continuing those efforts, when I spoke with the Ukrainian foreign ministers on the sidelines in Antalya, he essentially said that everything that he brought up with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov was not empowered by the Kremlin to do anything about. And we're talking about humanitarian corridors. We're talking about a ceasefire agreement. Everything he brought up to Mr. Lavrov said, hey, I don't have the mandate to do anything. What's your expectation for talks going forward? Do you think that President Putin is willing to give Sergei Lavrov some negotiating power?
Well, both of them are my colleagues, first of all. Secondly, we are facilitators and mediators, and we have to be honest broker. And it will not be appropriate to say one side is more forthcoming, one side is less. So everybody knows, I think, the positions of both sides. And our job is to actually help them to find this face-saving way out. And at the end, you know, these different tracks I just mentioned, at the end, who will give the final decision? Leaders, 2 presidents, Putin and Zelensky. So that's why we have been also trying to bring them together as well.
We've already heard from President Zelensky essentially giving way on the idea that Ukraine could become a member of NATO. It puts NATO, of course, in a bit of a difficult situation because from the very beginning, the United States, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, saying to me that this should be the determination of Ukraine, not left in the hands of Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think Ukraine understood that the NATO membership will not happen. It was not going to happen anyway, and many European allies were against this membership, NATO membership of Ukraine and Georgia. So Ukraine understood this perfectly. And to my mind, I have been advocating this more freely when I was not foreign minister of Turkey, that Ukraine has no luxury to choose between West or East, between Russia and Europe, between Turkey and Russia. Ukraine, Turkey's countries in our region should have a balanced foreign policy with everybody. We are NATO member, but we have been, despite all these difficulties, we have been working with Russia on different, very difficult files, Syria, Libya, and South Caucasus, and etc. So Ukraine should be led to have more balanced foreign policy by Russia, by all of us, but particularly by Europeans and West.
But it isn't just the idea that Turkey should be an arbiter for peace, is it? Because at the end of the day, you're hamstrung as much as the rest of Europe because you've got 85% of your wheat coming from Ukraine and Russia and the bulk of your energy coming from Russia as well. So there's a deep sense of urgency, no, on the part of the Turks to get something done.
This current situation has impact on all of us and on globalization, on different sectors, on Europe and beyond, energy, and look at the energy prices. And we have excellent relations with both sides, and we are doing business with them, trade, and our trade volume has been increased more than 70% in last year comparing the previous year. And we signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine in February, beginning of February, during the high-level strategic council meeting in Kiev. So the two partners, of course, it has impact on not only Turkey, but other Black Sea countries and Middle East, Europe, and South Caucasus, all of us. So it has to, we have to end this bloodshed and war. We need peace and stability in our region.
Well, if you look at Turkey specifically, your currency last year was one of the worst, and frankly the worst by far in terms of performance of the G20 nations. It was off 44%. Can Turkey afford for this crisis to go on for much longer?
Well, we stabilized these currency fluctuations. And despite this crisis, if you look, of course, energy prices went up everywhere. And so we stabilized our currency. And if you look at the growth rate, it was 11% last year. And if you look at the first quarter, we have been actually monitoring, it's very promising. And our export is increasing tremendously, production capacity.
I would be curious to understand your definition, sir, of stability of currency. And the reason I ask that is off 44% last year. When I'm sitting in a Turkish cab and they're forcing me to pay in euros while they check on a calculator to figure out what that equates in Turkish lira, I don't think that's a stable currency.
No,
I think that's pretty unstable.
Everybody, if that's like if $1 is equal to 2 Turkish lira, 10 Turkish lira, or if it is fixed, then nobody needs calculator. But I think if you go any other country that don't use the dollar or euro as currency, you have to do it. If you go to Poland, you have to do the same thing. You have to be fair.
When you think about what happens next as a NATO member, this poses a lot of different questions for Turkey specifically. You obviously purchased, quite infamously, the S-400 systems from Russia. There was talk at that time that you would potentially look to purchase the next generation of weapons from Russia. Is that still on the table, given what we're seeing?
Well, we purchased this S-400. It's a done deal. And recently we have seen these very interesting rumors that Turkey will, or Turkey is asked to give this S-400 to Ukraine. It's out of question. So it's really funny to raise this, and it was leaked by Americans, I think, so we never considered this. It's a done deal. Does Turkey need more air defense systems with that range? Yes. And we prefer to purchase them from United States and from allies. And if we cannot purchase from our allies, I have to find another source. Now, energy, you just mentioned energy. Our dependence to Russia on gas was 51% 4 years ago. Now it is less than 40%. So we are diversifying and finding the new energy sources. And we are also investing a lot in renewable. And on defense industry, now we are able to produce, thank God, alhamdulillah, more than 70% of our needs. And we are also working on the air defense system. They will be also as successful as our drones. But meanwhile, I need more air defense system. Our region is not safe haven for any of us. So in this case, we are still working on other alternatives. For instance, in Brussels, 2 days ago, my president met President Macron and Prime Minister Italy. And the main issue was SAMTI, air defense system. This is the joint venture of France and Italy. And we signed an agreement, a letter of intention with Eurosam like 8 years ago. Nothing happened until today. Now those two countries are more serious to have joint production in Turkey or to export SAMTI air defense system to my country.
So
I have to get it from somewhere.
So are you potentially considering more air defense system S-500 from Russia?
It is not a choice, or I have to consider any possibility. But my first choice is to purchase air defense system from my allies, if not from other sources.
You don't consider that a conflict of interest, given President Putin?
Why it should be conflict of interest? First, I have to protect
because he's illegally invaded a sovereign state.
My country is a sovereign country, and I have to protect my country, and I have to purchase my needs from any possible sources. But as I said, my first choice is my allies, United States, Eurosam, and European countries. We are working with UK, but at the end, if they don't want to sell any items to Turkey, what should I do? And despite all this support, Turkey supports to European security, Turkey supports to Ukraine, and still we cannot get export licenses from our NATO allies. And it is not my fault. And UK recently reversed this, and Boris Johnson called my president, and now we can import all this stuff that we need from UK. But we cannot get it from United States. We cannot get it from France or from some other NATO allies. So what should I do? I should wait for years and years to just convince our NATO allies or European friends to provide us something that we need urgently?
So there are limits for Turkey when it comes to the NATO alliance.
Well, I have also my own priority.
When you think about what happens next with regards to the refugee crisis, we're not just talking about Ukrainians flooding into Europe. We're also talking about Russians leaving en masse for places like Dubai and like Turkey. And that raises questions about havens for illicit finance. There's a report in Al Monitor suggesting that Roman Abramovich has put 2 of his yachts in Turkey. Can you confirm that those yachts are there?
Even before this crisis, we were telling everybody that this refugee crisis will continue. And the number of the people that will be leaving their countries will increase. And it has increased before this war. It went up to 85 million from 70
yes, but I'm talking about
years.
the oligarch crisis. And I mean the people with money who are leaving to Turkey.
You mentioned the refugee crisis, and now you don't let me to answer your question. And your problem is, your question is about this humanitarian crisis, or your concern is about these oligarchs? Look, whatever the activity in Turkey, it has to be legal. We will allow any legal and legitimate activities, and we will not allow any illegal activities in Turkey, whatever it is. Principal position, period.
would you consider Russian oligarchs who are sanctioned by the West, by European nations, to be a part of that illicit?
I just answered your question, I guess.
And so, yes. Now, can you
No,
confirm
I didn't say yes. I said
No.
I will allow any legal activities, and in my country, I cannot allow any illegal activities. This is a very simple answer.
So are
I
Russian
didn't say
oligarchs
yes,
welcome
I
in
didn't
Turkey?
say no. But my answer is very clear.
Are Russian oligarchs welcome in Turkey?
Well, if Russian oligarchs visit my country, I didn't, since I didn't join the sanctions, I am not implementing sanctions. In principle, we implement UN-approved sanctions. So if any Russian citizens want to visit Turkey, of course they can visit Turkey. Now Russians are coming to Turkey as tourists, no problem. Ukrainians are coming. The number of the Ukrainians that came to Turkey is more than 60,000 at this moment. So if you mean that whether these oligarchs can do any business in Turkey, then of course, if it is legal and if it is not against international law, I will consider. If it is against international law, then that's another story.
Walk me through how you see these talks playing out in the short term, because we've just seen the talks in Antalya. Do you believe that we're going to see these foreign ministers getting together again in the short term? Because we've just seen the president in Poland.
Well, if they agree to meet again, particularly to sign any ceasefire initially before the presidents, there is a possibility. But something must be cooked more at Belarusian track. And it is, I mean, we see some rapprochement over there, and let the two sides to give the details of it. And there is, of course, possibility to bring the foreign ministers first, and then presidents to seal the agreements.
Is the sticking point Donbass, or is the sticking point Crimea?
Well, they have, of course, they are all very sensitive issues, each of them. But it is not easy for them to reach an understanding on these very delicate issues while the war continues, while innocent people, civilians are dying. So these are the issues I think they can reach an understanding when there is a ceasefire in calmer and relatively more positive atmosphere.
When you think about this with regards to being a NATO member, the entire idea that NATO's mission in so many ways has been empowered by, or re-empowered perhaps, by the invasion of Ukraine. What does that mean for Turkey? Because we've seen so many differences, and we've just mentioned one of them, the S-400, for example, in how Turkey sees the world versus the rest of NATO. Do you feel like you are closer to the alliance now more than ever? Because all I ever hear when I interview NATO officials is how unified everyone is.
Well,
You don't sound too unified if you've got to look elsewhere for
I wish you look at the contributions of Turkey to NATO before you came over here. We are always in top 5 in terms of our contribution to NATO, NATO's activities. And financially also, our financial contribution to NATO budget is, I think we are, in terms of our contribution, we are in top 8. So we have been a NATO ally, and between NATO allies, there are other differences or differences between other NATO allies. Even during the debates and discussions on the joint statements or on NATO's reply to Russia's letter, and during the NATO-Russia Council meeting before this war, and we saw the differences between allies, between Baltic states and the other Western European countries and Poland, UK. There are also differences. We might in the future also have differences. But Turkey is a solid NATO ally, and Turkey is contributing to NATO and the alliance more than 90% of the NATO members.
So you feel that as a member of NATO, the alliance is at its strongest?
Look, we see the unity in general, more unity, and this is solidarity, allied solidarity. At last NATO summit demonstrated allied solidarity. And many leaders, including Biden, expressed that they have never seen such solidarity, allied solidarity in NATO, so which is good. And we have to show this solidarity. We should have one voice in such difficult situation. And in our response that to face the challenges and threats in our region and beyond. So the last ministerials, both foreign ministerials and defense ministers meeting and summit, we also observe this allied solidarity more than ever.
And final question, Foreign Minister. I mean, when you take a step back, it's very difficult to project foreign policy power over the long term if you don't have solid economic power back at home. When you look at what's happened to Turkey in the last 10 plus years that President Erdogan has been in office, in spite of that initial burst of growth, we've seen the economy suffering deeply in the last few years, and that is in part due to his very creative policies, and I'm talking about the fiscal monetary policies of the central bank and various central bank governors, and there have been several. When you take a step back and think about it, what we've seen in the Russian economy in the last few weeks since President Putin decided to invade Ukraine has been total economic destruction. What's your advice to the Russians?
Between questions, you really enjoy criticizing or targeting my country and my economy. I hope that it was based on the truth. Well, look at the last 20 years. Look at the figures. Be objective. And per capita income of Turkey 18 years ago was $3,000. Now it is almost $10,000. Okay? And we are, in terms of the income and per capita income, we are in top 20 and top 17. And if you look at the growth rate in last 18 years, it's more than 5%. Every country, every region can face such economic crisis. Didn't Europe have such economic crisis like 8 years ago? And in other parts of the world, and America also suffered a lot from the economic crisis, and high inflation now is the main problem of even the strongest economies, and all of us. Of course, Russian economy is hit tremendously by these sanctions, and it affects its currency rate, and ruble, and also if you look at the figures, economic growth rate, there will be a negative growth rate for this quarter. It's estimates, the institutions are estimating 35%, and for the first quarter, of course, inevitably, Russian economy will be affected with these sanctions and the economic policies. There is a war. But Turkish economy is getting better and Turkey is growing. So don't worry about that.
Your Excellency, thank you so much.
I hope you were not disturbed with my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu. Thank you, Hadley, for this discussion. Thank you both very much. From one crisis to the next. From one of the world's newest crises, Ukraine, and the long shadow it continues to cast on so many countries, to one of the world's never-ending crises, Afghanistan. It is where America fought its longest war, lasting almost 20 years and costing its taxpayers over $2.3 trillion, according to Brown University's cost of war project, that is $300 million a day over a 20-year period. Once known as the graveyard of empires, it has certainly lived up to its label. Since late August, it is firmly under the control of the Islamic Caliphate of Afghanistan, the Taliban, with whom the United States government signed the Doha Agreement. Afghanistan, though, remains in crisis. Our next panel looks at the current state of Afghanistan and the legacy of Western involvement in the country. Between full retreat and re-engagement, Afghanistan and the role of the West. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome our panelists, Niels Annen, German Parliamentary State Secretary, Hosna Jalil, former Afghan Deputy Minister for Policy and Strategy, Thomas West, the US Special Envoy for Afghanistan at the State Department, and Dr. Mutlaq Al-Qahtani, Special Envoy of the Foreign Minister of the State of Qatar. The session will be moderated by Steve Clements, editor-at-large at The Hill and host of The Bottom Line on Al Jazeera English. But before we begin, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, President of the Foundation Council at the Munich Security Conference Foundation, will give us opening remarks, and Elisa Curtis will give us closing remarks after the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite our panelists to the stage as we prepare to begin our next session? That's a round. That's a round.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Please take your seats. We want to continue and focus at this moment on Afghanistan. My name is Wolfgang Ischinger. I come from the Munich Security Conference, and it is my privilege and my great pleasure to partner once again with the Doha Forum. And it's an even greater pleasure this year to do this together with the Center for a New American Security. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Doha Forum, as most of our eyes are currently focused on Ukraine, we must not lose sight of what's going on in Afghanistan. And we need to raise the question to the highest possible level of what, if anything, our countries should do, actually must do, to help alleviate the plight of the Afghan population. This applies first and foremost to the humanitarian situation in the country, with more than half of the population at risk of acute food insecurity, more than 1 million children facing life-threatening levels of hunger. As David Miliband has put it, the international house of cards that was Afghanistan's economy has come falling down, and we must not stand by idly. The Munich Security Conference has highlighted all of this in our annual Munich Security Report, and we raised it at our conference a month ago in February, that we must not overlook the rising international security risks emanating again from Afghanistan, including a renewed threat of terrorism. I'm therefore excited about this discussion today, which we were able to organize, a discussion about the lessons learned of 20 years of Western engagement and of its failures, the prospects for the future of Afghanistan, and the role that the West and other global and regional actors should or must play. Are we doing the right thing? Are we listening sufficiently to? and working sufficiently with Afghanistan's neighbors? Question mark. Do we actually have a vision for Afghanistan? Or are we just reacting to events in an effort to prevent the humanitarian situation from getting worse and worse? So with these brief introductory words, it's my pleasure now to hand over to Steve Clements, who will introduce his wonderful panel. It's a great panel, and I'm very excited to be able to listen to it right now. Steve, you have the floor.
I just want to thank Wolfgang Ischinger. Please give him a round of applause. Of course, chairman of the Munich Security Conference. You know, sometimes when you think if you didn't have a Wolfgang Ischinger, or you didn't have a Doha Forum, what kinds of platforms, if you didn't have the Munich Security Conference, the Center for New American Security, provoking us to think in uncomfortable ways about what's going on, I think we would be much less well off. I should also mention that at the end of this session, we're going to have Lisa Curtis, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program, Center for New American Security, come in and chat with us about, or give her own thoughts about where this is going as well. We have a fantastic panel with us. Just to my far left, we have Mr. Thomas West. He's Special Envoy for Afghanistan in the U.S. Department of State. Much in the news today and yesterday, but we'll get to that in a moment. Niels Annan is Minister of State for the Federal Office, Foreign Office of Germany. Niels, it's great to see you. And we have someone who's been a real hero through some very trying circumstances. Deputy Minister Hosna Jalil, former Deputy Minister, Policy and Strategy at the Minister of the Interior of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Let me just say that in preparation for today, I went back and spent a day, because that's about how long it takes to read it, a very long article by George Packer in The Atlantic called Betrayal. And it goes into many of the human dimensions of what the departure from Afghanistan created in people's lives, the desperation to get out, what the stakes were for those people who believed, not only in the United States being there, but its partners and allies in Afghanistan, to deliver a very different ending than what we have seen today. And I would just like to ask Hosna Jalil to help us set the stage here today of what the equities are that sometimes in forums, the human dimensions of this. You yourself have been threatened, death threats, harassed. You fought your way when you were actually there before the Taliban took over. But I'd love you to help set the human part of this conversation before I jump to Thomas and Niels to talk about some of the more political and policy dimensions of what's unfolding. I think
it's on. A couple of years ago, when the Taliban engaged politically more actively, they smartly and strategically divided themselves into two different phases. The moderate phase of the Taliban, which they claimed or pretended to be the Afghan Taliban, just to open the door for political engagement and diplomatic negotiation, because at that point in time, I believe they knew that they can't militarily take over Afghanistan and they can't get the battlefield from us. And then the hardcore wing, which was, they pretend to be the Pakistan-backed Taliban, and of course the military wing, which is led by the Haqqani Network, which is a designated terrorist group. That was a trap that we all fell into. As an Afghan woman, having lived throughout their regime, their previous regime, having fought with them for 20 years, we did know that they have not changed. They're the same Taliban. Yes, they might have conflict within their own network, which is quite common with all insurgent groups, with all terrorist groups, but at the same time, within states, we have conflicts of ideas, we have conflicts of interest, but we have a more nonviolent way to resolve it. Now, the humanitarian crisis that we have after the collapse of the state or the withdrawal of the international forces and international community from Afghanistan, I cannot say that that was expected so quick, but considering that the Taliban are having the same core beliefs, they have not changed much. They might have changed their strategy and approach, but they have not changed in terms of their ideology. That was expected. But when it comes to the true stories of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, yes, there might be different stories of having Taliban well behaving with some, but at the same time being brutal to some others. I would say they're getting more brutal and brutal. The reason that we hear less of those stories is because the media is censored. And they definitely are not well behaved. It depends on backgrounds. It depends on, I would say, the grudges they hold, but they definitely are not well behaved, and they can never be well behaved.
Well, thank you. Thomas West, I mean, I think the adage in foreign policy that we all struggle with is that there can be horizons of hope of what you'd like to try to achieve, but it's very important in foreign policy to see things as they are. So seeing where things they are, what is in the news about you and your work was there was supposed to be on the edge of the Doha Forum a very key meeting that might have led, as I understand it, to our recognizing, to the United States recognizing the government in Afghanistan, but that has come undone. So can you share with us what has come undone, the negotiations that have come undone, and what the consequence of this are?
Thank you. Maybe I can take a step back and talk about the evolution of international engagement with Afghanistan since the middle of August. I was there in Kabul supporting the effort to relocate Afghans at the time. My job was to engage with the Taliban. They provided, like it or not, some urgent operational support. They closed some particular streets close to the airport. They were folks that we needed to engage with at that time. If you fast forward several months now, 7 months, I have engaged and led interagency dialogue with the Taliban roughly every 5 or 6 weeks. So we've been doing it. We've been engaged with them at every. Can you talk about the different levels and components of why are they talking to us? What do they want from us? What do we want from them? Well, we're talking about our interests, and we're talking about the fates of 40 million Afghans. I think a policy of total and complete isolation would be an abandonment of 40 million people. And so we're talking about the modalities of an urgent humanitarian response. We're talking about the fact that a purely humanitarian response to this crisis that's underway would be deeply insufficient. So we need to not just admire the problem of a broken banking sector, but seek ways to fix it. We're talking about a professionalization of the central bank so that the international financial community can begin to have confidence in dealing with it. We're talking about terrorism. We're talking about women's rights. And frankly, Steve, it won't surprise you that I think I am among many, many people who've been talking to the Taliban for months now, and I was surprised at the turnaround this past Wednesday. And I think you've seen the world react and in condemning this move. It is a breach, first and foremost, of the Afghan people's trust, because they made commitments to the people.
Guarantee or that commitment on women's education, particularly for women that were teenagers and older, was an explicit part of the deal.
One of the first times we sat down with the Taliban in October, again, in a formal setting, they had a request of us. Please put our civil servants back to work, 500,000 strong. And we thought a logical place to start, given that the sector resonates so much in the international community, was education. And we had requests of the Taliban as well. Number one, that women and girls could attend at all levels across large swaths of the country. We didn't want to try to hold the Taliban to a higher standard than the Republic, but it's certainly my hope that in the coming generations we'll see women and girls attend in every corner of the country at all levels. Number two, we wanted to see a monitoring mechanism. And number three, we wanted to see a serious and rigorous curriculum. And I'll tell you that over a period of months, not just the United States, the international community received the necessary assurances. And more importantly, the Afghan people were told that on March 23, we would see women and girls attend secondary school again across large swaths of the country, and that did not occur. I believe that hope is not lost. I've talked to a lot of Afghans here who also believe that, and you know, I'm hopeful that that we will see a reversal of this decision in the coming days.
Thank you. Minister Anand, when I listened to Thomas West talk about the goals, the objectives that we've had, the different modalities with Afghanistan, many of these were also in place when we had a military force there, when we had a very different sort of dynamic. We still had it. We're dealing with a different condition now where we're less present. I just want to talk to you about the efficacy of achieving these goals now. Is it better to do it without military there? Do you have any hope that engagement with the Taliban can be productive and constructive? Because when I reflect on what Hasna Jalil just shared with us, is she just very clearly said there has been no change in the Taliban that she knew before and that she sees today.
Well, look, I think first of all, our engagement with Afghanistan goes way back. My ministry, the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, has been engaging with Afghanistan since the 50s. So I just wanted to say that in the beginning to underline that historic relationship that developed over so many generations. And we saw tough times, also during the democratic government that we and the international community supported. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we never had, or almost never had, a period where the whole country was under control of the legitimate government. So somehow, aid workers, the international community, the military, the politicians, diplomats, had to find a way to deal with the circumstances. And so the nature of the Taliban is no news to anybody. But I think what Tom said is important. We can and we should not forget that this is about the fate of the people, of a big and an important country, and people who have and had hopes for their, you know, for their lives, for their families, for their plans. But apart from the humanitarian aspects, this is a vital region also for global stability. So I believe we need to find pragmatic ways to make an investment that will guarantee the economic survival of the country, that invest in the people and especially in women and girls. And so the announcement that we saw, and I think we need to be very clear here, came to our government really as a shock. And I hope that the Taliban, if they are listening, they also understand that this can be a potential game changer. We really need to have a revision and correction of that decision to enable us to continue our engagement with Afghanistan.
Before I jump back to Haas, I want to ask Niels another question, and I may get this wrong. Sometimes it comes out wrong the way I want to say it, but we're sort of at this inflection point in history, and I'm not sure I agree with what I'm about to say, but I think it's an important question to ask. And that is, as we look at Ukraine, as we look at the legacy of the last 2 decades in Afghanistan, do we have a problem in the West of offering what appears to other nations false promises? Ukraine clearly thought, at least President Zelensky, whom we heard from this morning, believed that there was prospect and hope in a deeper and more integrated relationship with Europe and clearly with NATO. NATO accepted that deal in 2008. Afghanistan, after the United States and its allies and ISAF came in, basically set up schools, set up, change civil society, tried to experiment with democracy, bring in civil society institutions and justice. And if you all Google Hasna Jalil's name, you will see her own struggle within that system when she was in office to sort of do that. I'm not against offering those hopes, but it almost looks like, if you're on the other side of the equation, like the West has reneged on what it was promising to do. Do we have a problem with our own inability to be there in the long run for nations that we give hope to?
I think it's hard to dispute that we have that problem. But the question is, what is the consequence? And, I don't live in Afghanistan. I have been visiting the country many, many times. I represent a district in the German parliament from my hometown, Hamburg, which hosted the biggest community of Afghans. I went to school with and boy from Herat who was fleeing because of the Soviet invasion. So I think the judgment should not be up to us, but to the Afghans. But I have the impression that there is something that we helped to create, not what we hoped to create. But the Afghanistan of today is not the same as the Afghanistan of the 90s. And you see that. People taking the streets because of the announcements that we just saw. There is a civil society. There are different structures. And so, yes, I think we are all very disappointed, and we need to draw the right lessons also of the Afghanistan experience. And I'm happy that we talk about Afghanistan, because right now, and with good reasons, but all the attention is on Ukraine, and we cannot afford. We need to do both. We need to answer the threat of Russia's invasion, but at the same time care about Afghanistan, what is happening in Yemen and other parts of the world.
Jose Jalil, I want to come back to the question about, I'm sure you have many family members that have now exited Afghanistan. You have many family members that are in Afghanistan. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts and their sense of whether or not the last 20 years, would you have liked to have seen it evolve a different way? Did the effort make a difference in the long run in terms of people's lives and give them something different? Or was this, I suppose, a waste? And I guess the second just corollary to that is, while we are cutting off Russia and Putin from so many of the dimensions of international financial architecture, but we are giving the Taliban potentially access to development aid and assistance. Do you see a conflict in those two approaches?
Coming to the first question, I do believe that it was not a waste. The last 20 years of presence of the international community, the international forces, it definitely was not a waste. Yes, we have lost a lot, and we grieve for it, but it's not a waste. The reason is because we facilitated the growth of a generation, which makes 2/3 of the population today in Afghanistan. They know how a better life looks like. They don't have the experience of the Taliban regime like our generation, definitely, and that's the reason that they won't give up hope, actually, to rebuild Afghanistan for their own selves. So they are today's Afghanistan's potential today. And that is the generation, actually, I'm so proud of, and they make majority of the literate population of Afghanistan today. They're loud, they believe in freedom, they believe in democracy, and they find all means, actually, to resist in a very civil way, actually, against the Taliban. Yes, that was not a waste. That left its own legacy, positive legacy. But the problem that I can see here with the Western approach you just mentioned is that the coalition in Afghanistan signed up for a very time-consuming process, but it gave less time and more money to Afghanistan. And that was not what the process really needed. It required maybe less money and more time. When it comes to my family, actually, my family is a mix of rural Afghanistan and urban Afghanistan. My sister, youngest sister, is part of the post-9/11 generation. And I can see the change of the last 20 years international engagement with Afghanistan in her face. She's louder than me, she's more resilient than me, definitely, and I can see she's an ordinary, definitely, daughter of Afghanistan, and there are millions like her. So I can see all those faces as the change in Afghanistan. And when it comes to the Taliban's access to aid, the problem is that it is a regime that we don't know the money goes to Afghanistan. Would they buy more weapons? Would they expand the number of their fighters? And considering that their military wing is still led by Haqqani Network, which is, I'm repeating myself, a designated terrorist group. But at the same time, the challenge is that we also cannot ignore the fact that Afghanistan is dealing with humanitarian crisis, and we need to respond to that immediately. So what I would say is that we need to engage the local or the community-based structures which existed in the past. We need to reestablish them in order to engage them in the aid distribution to minimize the risk of, I would say, having Taliban access to that aid.
Thank you. Thomas, let me ask you how we move forward from here. And I know you're working very hard to sort of look at the humanitarian dimensions, how we use whatever leverage we have with allies in the region around hoping to shape the choices that the Taliban leadership has. But one dimension of this conflict that is it's Ukraine really has taken over the U.S. media. We don't read a lot about our topic today, not as much as we should, but part of that story, which George Packer tells in the Atlantic article he wrote, but I've since followed up to try to look at it, are things like the SIV visas, the provide, Qatar, UAE, other nations provided such important support in getting a lot of Afghans out of the country. But there was this commitment that people at least felt, if not explicitly given, that many of these people would be processed into the United States, that we would become a welcome home, particularly for those people who served as translators, that were our friends and supporters in the Afghanistan experiment. And there's been a lot of criticism of the State Department that it has just stopped processing those visas. What's the situation, and what can we do to be as much a part of that story to support those people who believed in the United States and left? How can we fix that if you think it's important? And what are the dimensions we have to get right as we look forward with the incumbent government right now in Kabul?
Thank you. So I'm not going to entirely shirk your question, but I'll kind of half shirk it, because there is a whole piece of the State Department that's focused on relocations of Afghans. And I'll just have to be clear with you, my job is to focus on policy vis-a-vis the 40 million Afghans.
But I wanted to make you responsible for all of it, give you a raise.
Right. So look, the bottom line is, I think demand to depart Afghanistan exceeds the possibility of the United States and, frankly, any society to truly absorb if it's voluntary. And I think we all have an interest in ensuring that the Taliban follow policies that will keep smart, educated, talented Afghans in Afghanistan. I can't encourage any Afghan I know today to do so, but I think it's all in our interest for smart, qualified Afghans to stay in the country. Now, when it comes to the effort to assist Afghans to whom we have a special commitment, that continues, and it is, again, a big piece of the State Department that's focused on it.
Let me just ask you real quick, when I think of other countries that have leverage inside Afghanistan, of course Pakistan, but that goes without saying, but Russia has made a big play in Afghanistan. China has, of course. Iran is a border country that has a lot to do with what happens in the West in Afghanistan. Does our influence, German, American, the Western influence, come anywhere near Chinese influence or Russia influence in Afghanistan today?
I think it does, yes. Now look, the countries of the region definitely have a unique relationship and influence that many of the countries of the West do not. They share borders, they share linguistic ties, centuries of history with one another. So the Pakistanis, the Russians, the Chinese, the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Iranians, they do have a special kind of influence over the country. The countries of the West have a special history and, frankly, the financial appetite and potential wherewithal to take steps that will stabilize the economy that the region is not in a position to take. And I'd say that's pretty big leverage in this situation.
Niels, one of the interesting phenomenons in foreign relations, if you're a big power out there, is you ask other folks to do things and you eventually take them for granted. Now, Doha, Qatar really stepped up. They are running the airport on Kabul. They helped evacuate tens of thousands of folks out. Other countries helped as well. But there's been a big burden and a big responsibility in Qatar. We were going to have a minister with us today, but because of a lot of what has happened and unfolded, that he wasn't able to join us. But I also heard just a few minutes ago the foreign minister of Turkey up here reminding what Turkey had done by way of those refugees and giving support with a lot of German support in this. I heard a little bit of like, don't take us for granted comments from the foreign minister. Don't forget what we've done in a time of crisis. I have to tell you, behind the scenes in Qatar, there's a little bit of fear that there isn't an understanding in the United States, for instance, of the vital role that Qatar has played. So I'd just be interested, you know, given your role as administrator, what do we do to solve that taken for granted tendency that often happens in situations like this? No, to you. Yeah.
To me,
because
okay,
you did it with the Turks, and
yeah,
you know, Germans take people for granted too.
No, but because I had the impression the question was also a little bit directed.
He'll get a chance.
But look, it's a very good place, Doha, to talk about Afghanistan, because we really have not only during the days of the military evacuation, but where, by the way, also I think the cooperation on the ground in the dramatic days was exemplary, also with the United States, our teams of the embassies, the military. We would not have been able to do it without that cooperation. But also in the weeks and months afterwards, we had the privilege to cooperate with our friends and partners here in Qatar. But it's also true that other countries like Turkey, but I also want to mention Pakistan. So the cooperation with Islamabad was also crucial. And as I said before, the German-Afghan relationship, the many Afghans who are living in Germany, who have fled Afghanistan because of prior crises, they are part of the discussion. So we are not going to forget about that. And, you know, the German Development Corporation has had many Afghans working for our cooperation projects, and so there's an ongoing effort to bring people in need also to Germany, and so we are not going to forget, and on the contrary, we are going to continue cooperating with our friends, and I hope, and I'm rather confident, that we are going to find ways, and the last difficult weeks and months showed that it's possible to find a way to support the immediate needs, but also the long-term development needs of the country. And I'm afraid that also with the recent decision, but also with the general political environment, we will have to make sure that this aid and resources are not going directly to the Taliban. But that wouldn't be the first country or crisis region in history. But in order to be able to implement that, we rely on our partners, but also on our own expertise on the ground.
Just before I jump to Hossein a minute, do you make that aid contingent upon Taliban behavior?
So
make that aid, that development assistance, that engagement. You said you didn't want the resources to flow to the Taliban, but do you make, I mean, maybe in Germany you can do that easier than you can in the United States, but I have to tell you that in the United States it becomes very difficult, even for international aid organizations, to deal with a nation that is monstrous, right, or the leadership is monstrous. So do you make your aid contingent upon constructive Taliban behavior?
I think we need to be very precise here. When we invest in humanitarian aid, that's by definition based on the humanitarian principles, not contingent on, you know, the orientation of the government, because it's immediate needs that are going to be addressed. When it comes to development aid, so the long-term investments, that's going to be more complicated. Right now, we don't have a legal base to cooperate with the Taliban government. We don't recognize that government. And as my colleague mentioned, leaders like Mr. Haqqani and others are on an international terrorist list. But that doesn't mean that we don't have instruments to support the people in Afghanistan. And I think our expectation from Germany for an inclusive government, a government that guarantees basic human rights, which means that women and children need to enjoy their basic rights and go to school, for example. As long as this is not fulfilled, I cannot see German taxpayers' money going to the Taliban, but we are here on the long-term perspective. We don't abandon the country, but we need to solve the political problems.
Thomas, before I ask Hosna to take us, finish before Lisa Curtis comes up, when, again, come back to this powerful article that was written, it was very clear that those Afghans that work with the United States were, many of them, killed and targeted, murdered, harassed, etc. How do we avoid that as we continue to engage Afghanistan from a U.S. policy perspective in the future of not finding and developing friends, recipients of our support who end up being harassed by their own government?
I think it has to be a robust campaign of engagement directly with the Taliban. I think we've seen the creation of particular commissions to go after those who are acting inconsistent with this policy of general amnesty. But we haven't seen enough. We haven't seen a systematic treatment, but it's got to be a much more robust effort than we've done to date.
Well, thank you. And Hosna Jalil, I want to give you all the power of this moment to ask you, because I know you deal with international organizations, you travel, and I'd like you to tell those of us who are trying to understand what we should do now. Now, today, this is a different thing, particularly with women who have been evacuated. What should be our strategy of engagement with them? What are some of the things you'd like to instruct us by way of culture and opportunity and engagement that we may not be hearing well enough?
What I would propose is let's divide our efforts into the immediate humanitarian crisis response, which we have to deal with right now because people are starving, they have financial problem, and some of them, of course, they have, not some, but majority, they have security problem, which requires another course of action, of course. But let's help people with the basic needs in terms of access to health facilities, but at the same time in terms of their basic needs, of course. And then the other one needs to be more of a midterm and long-term course of action. And that definitely is helping, particularly when it comes to the women who have left Afghanistan and the women who are in Afghanistan and they're representing democracy in action on the streets of Afghanistan. Let's help them, let's facilitate the political dialogues between them, between all the opposing parties, which does not necessarily are aligned with the women who are in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. The technocrats, the bureaucrats, let's help all these political dialogues so that we give the Afghan people in the midterm and long term another option if there would be a change in regime.
Right.
That might be gradual, but in a non-violent way, we need to give the Afghan people another option in terms of regime. The mistake we made in the last 20 years at Afghanistan, we did not facilitate the development and the growth of political parties in Afghanistan so that we could give the Afghan people a third option beyond the Taliban and the state that people partially have been unsatisfied with. So let's start those political dialogues, and I'm sure there will be a gradual progress, but at the same time, the people will own the progress and the regime will be more stable and sustainable.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. The candor you brought in from very different perspectives, actually all three of you, even between Niels Anand and Thomas, were quite remarkable, and I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Thomas West, Special Envoy for Afghanistan from the U.S. Department of State, Niels Anand, Parliamentary State Secretary, Minister of State from the Federal Foreign Office in Germany, and Hosna Jalil, former Deputy Minister of Policy Strategy, the Ministry of the Interior in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. As you give them a round of applause, I want to invite Lisa Curtis, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, to share with us thoughts. But first, big round of applause for a great discussion. Thank you.
On behalf of the Center for a New American Security, I wish to thank the Doha Forum and the Munich Security Conference for partnering with us on this very important program. A special thanks to Ambassador Ischinger, as well as the distinguished panelists, His Excellency Niels Anand, Ms. Hosna Jalil, and Special Representative Tom West, and of course, our excellent moderator, Steve Clemens. Our three organizations conceived this program last fall with the recognition of the critical role United States-European cooperation has played and will continue to play in Afghanistan. Whether it is meeting the humanitarian needs of the Afghan people, standing with the Afghan people in support of human rights, especially those of women and girls, monitoring terrorism threats, or coordinating with our regional partners, transatlantic cooperation is key to preserving the hard-won gains of Afghan civil society made over the last 20 years. With Russia's war in Ukraine, there is renewed emphasis on and an acknowledgement that the United States and Europe must work closely on the most pressing global issues, whether that is in Eastern Europe, in the Indo-Pacific region, or in Afghanistan, as we have discussed today. We also must recognize the critical role that Qatar has played in Afghanistan. The Qatari government played an indispensable role both in peace process efforts over the last 3 years and in helping to evacuate tens of thousands of Afghans from the country last fall. I was able to visit Qatar last October with CNAS CEO Richard Fontaine, and we witnessed firsthand the extraordinary Qatari efforts to help displaced Afghans. Secretary Blinken even acknowledged that no country in the world had done more than Qatar to assist the evacuation and relocation efforts. And we are hopeful that Qatar will use its good offices to help ensure that girls will be able to attend high school and university. The growing humanitarian crisis and the Taliban's failure to uphold the rights of women and girls will compel the United States to remain closely engaged in Afghanistan. And there is an opportunity to work more closely with like-minded European and regional partners to address both the humanitarian situation, but also to condition our longer-term development assistance and engagement with the Taliban on their policies on human rights and counterterrorism. Unfortunately, the Taliban failed to pass a major test this week on human rights with their refusal to open secondary schools to Afghan girls. The hopes and dreams of girls across the country were crushed by the Taliban's arbitrary decision to close the doors of education to girls over 11 years old. It was cruel, and it demonstrated that the international community cannot trust the Taliban to keep their word on important human rights commitments. I heard a statistic at a lunch that I attended today that 87% of Afghans support equal opportunity to education by both males and females. Therefore, it is pragmatic to expect the Taliban to respect the wishes of the population to allow girls to attend high school and women to attend university. The challenges in Afghanistan are immense, and they'll require close coordination and cooperation among like-minded nations that care about the human rights and the humanitarian needs of the Afghan people. And hopefully today's session has provided ideas for further cooperation between our countries in seeking to shape Taliban behavior as we move forward and support a better future for the Afghan people. Thank you for attending. This concludes today's session.
Terrific. Thank you, Lisa Curtis. Thank you, Wolfgang Ischinger, Thomas West, Neil Zanan, and Hosni Jalal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you to all your panelists as well for this insightful discussion. As we go on to our next and final session of this afternoon, it is a newsmaker interview with someone who holds the title of Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy. He leads the local organizing committee for Qatar of the 2022 FIFA World Cup. And with all due respect to all the VIPs gathered here today, our next guest is the man you need to know if you're a football fan. I don't know where he is. I'm looking for him, but let me tell him loud and clear from this stage, I am. It's a pleasure to invite Hassan Athawadi, who will be joined by my former colleague from Al Jazeera English, MSNBC anchor and host of Ayman Muhyiddin. Welcome to you both.
Ladies and gentlemen, if everyone can take their seats so we can start this session, please. We are with, undoubtedly, as Rida was saying, the man of the hour. And I was going to say, if there's anyone who has an excuse to be late these days here in Qatar, it's probably you. So, first of all, how are you doing?
A little bit tired, but good. Frazzled a little bit, but okay.
Are you going to make it?
So far, it looks like I am, yes.
There's a lot to talk about, and you know, the nice thing, to be honest, when I was invited to do this, I was really honored because you and I have been speaking for the last couple of years. We've spoken in New York, we've spoken at the UN, and I feel like we've been having this ongoing conversation about Qatar's preparations for the World Cup and what kind of event it's going to be, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But I thought I'd start this session with some of the news this week, and I'm sure for you it has felt like an eternity, but it probably has been the last 12 years. I want to start with the comments that have been made by the Dutch football coach, Louis van Gaal. He, if anyone hasn't heard, had some harsh words about Qatar hosting the 2022 World Cup. He said it was ridiculous and it was motivated by financial and monetary interests for FIFA. I want to give you a chance to respond to those comments by the Dutch football coach.
I mean, thank you very much, Ayman, for that. And look, I mean, I'd already responded to that comment, but I'll come back and say it as simple as this. I think, you know, it's a very irresponsible and ill-informed statement to be made. If you look at this region, if you look at the passion that this region has for the tournament, if you look at the capabilities over the past 10 years, and even beyond that, even before we bid for the World Cup, whether you look at the Asian Games in 2006 and the history that Qatar has continuously proven in terms of hosting major events, sporting and otherwise, I think we've developed a track record that showcases our abilities to host major events. And I think more importantly, the region itself has continuously shown the world, even though maybe not everybody paid attention, that we are a football-loving nation, we are passionate, we are a welcoming nation, and it's simply put our time, you know, to host this tournament. And that was the essence of our bid as well. It's the first time for the Middle East and the Arab world to host, and we're doing it proudly, and we're doing it very successfully. You know, as the previous test events have shown, you know, the Arab Cup last year was a great success and a resounding success. And I think what it did is it brought to the prominence, again, the passion that people have in this region, but it also did something else. It showed the level of football. The level of football over here. I mean, if we're talking about purely from football development perspective, over the last 10 years, Qatar started with, you know, somewhat of a less successful team. Today, we're Asian champions. Today, we are, you know, we've participated in European competitions, we've participated in South American competitions. So purely from a football developing perspective, it's left a legacy on the country and as well as the region.
And you've successfully just completed hosting the Arab Cup, which I think for anybody who's familiar with the region would say was a seminal moment. I think a lot of people saw the opening ceremony, were moved by it, touched by it. And I think it raised a question for people like myself who spend a lot of time between the West and here about some of the criticism that is directed towards Qatar and whether you feel from the position, from your perch, is there a double standard that is being applied to the way Qatar is hosting the World Cup? I mean, we have this conversation now, and particularly in context of what has happened with Ukraine, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the double standards have become glaring, and sometimes it becomes apparent that, you know, I'm curious to get your thoughts, it becomes apparent that there is a double standard. Do you see that? Is that a part of the reason why there is so much scrutiny on Qatar hosting this event?
You know, I always try to avoid using, you know, these words in terms of double standards, so on, but I'll talk about it maybe a little bit more in the perspective of, yes, you know, when we first won the right, we were an unknown entity, and it was understandable that people might not know us and so, you know, have a lot of questions. Having said that, I think the level of scrutiny that we've gone through over the last 12 years, I don't think any other host nation had to undergo or had to go through. The level of doubts. But then again, you know, to a certain extent, you say it comes with the baggage. But we have had to endure a lot more scrutiny. We had to endure a lot more skepticism, cynicism. But I think we've put our head down, and every step of the way, we've proven, you know, that the promises that we made in 2010, we started achieving them. We've achieved every promise that we've made. We've delivered. The legacy that we talked about when we talk about the tournament is not a legacy that's going to come after the tournament. It's a legacy that is coming and being delivered before the tournament. And I think in terms of, you know, the time for the Arab world to shine in global football, in the world football, you know, we've always said the time is now. Well, we said it in 2010. Her Highness said it in the final presentation. The time is now. And I think we are beginning to deliver, you know, the seminal event, the major, I think probably the biggest event in the Arab world right now. There is, as I said, I keep saying it, there is a level of skepticism and cynicism, and unfortunately it's built upon a certain stereotype or the way people view the Arab world and the way people view our capabilities and abilities. I think this World Cup, hopefully, and our aim is that it does away with that stereotype. It starts breaking down for that stereotype.
And we're going to get into that in just a second. Let me just ask one more news-related question, and then we'll kind of broaden it out a little bit. Not too long ago, we saw the world sporting body, FIFA, UEFA, others, strip Russia for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A lot of people said that was justified. It is obviously, it raises an interesting question about sports and politics, because we have seen in the context of soccer and some of the human rights issues and causes in this part of the world, Arab players get punished for some of the expression of solidarity with Palestinians or expressing solidarity with Gaza. We've seen FIFA has encouraged players not to do that, in some cases even punished players for taking political stands when it comes to what they perceive to be their human rights causes. What is your reaction to FIFA suspending Russia from the World Cup and participating? And again, I go back to this question, do you think that it is a double standard that Arab countries expressing politics in their sports now may be viewed differently?
Look, I think, you know, for our side, over the last 12 years, we've been very, very committed to the fact that we separate sports from politics. And the main reason is because we've always viewed sports as the platform that we can try to bring people together, bring fans together, bring athletes together, and so on. And that's been the position that we've always taken. It's very, very important to create that platform where we can try to leave aside differences and kind of create bonds that leads to ultimately, let's say, more of a stronger relationship between people, leaving aside, as I said, ideologies, politics, and so on. Now, the actions that were taken by FIFA, again, first and foremost, any act of aggression is condemned, and that's something that, you know, as a state we condemn it, as an individual, you know, definitely anything that affects human life or, you know, the tragedies that we see, creates refugee situations in anywhere, any part of the world, is unacceptable. It's been happening in this part of the world over the last 10 years. It's something that we've unfortunately seen at our doorsteps. And I think what this tournament, what the World Cup, what major sporting events create is an opportunity to try to, as I said, you know, I won't say it's a safe haven, but it's an opportunity really to try to kind of, it's the one spark of unity. It's the one spark of inclusiveness. It's the one spark. The sparks of war are everywhere, and once they're lighted, you can see them spreading throughout the region, throughout the globe. We need to start investing more and more in platforms that bring people together. We need to start investing more and more in opportunities where we can try to resolve conflicts, or at least create the environment to resolve conflicts through dialogue, through engagement, through inclusivity. Now, and that's, you know, I might not have answered your question specifically, but for me it's simple as this. I always believe in the fact that we do need to separate sports from politics.
I was sitting with some Qatari friends yesterday in a majlis, and the word legacy is a word that you use. It's literally in the name of the Supreme Committee, and it is something that they asked. They asked what happens the day after the World Cup to Qatar. What do you want to see happen as the legacy of the World Cup for Qatari citizens who may be worried that right now there are a lot of resources committed to advancing and developing Qatar and the world's attention is on it, and maybe there are good things being done. The day after the World Cup is over, they want to know what happens to their state.
Well, again, I mean, I think it's very important to highlight one thing, because everybody keeps asking what happens after that, as if the reason the state of Qatar exists is for the World Cup. And that's not the case. I mean, we are a state, you know, we're a country before the World Cup, we're going to be a country remaining after the World Cup. The investment in education, the investment in the economy, the investment in technology, in renewable energy, in the sporting infrastructure, and the sporting industry in itself has started before the World Cup. The World Cup has accelerated a lot of that investment. It's accelerated a lot of these initiatives. It will continue after that, and there are plans that will occur after that, of course. You know, again, like I said, the investment in terms of the educational infrastructure and the educational institutions, the investment in the medical sector as well. We've got some of the state-of-the-art medical institutions and hospitals as well over here. For example, Sidra Hospital itself is something to be proud of. So, you know, the simple answer is the state will continue after the World Cup. The investments are out there. You know, the industries are being developed and being again committed to in terms of significant amount of investments. What the World Cup did, it accelerated a number of initiatives prior to the tournament. So, for example, if we're looking at transportation infrastructure today, for anybody that's visited Qatar, for anybody that's, you know, there might still be some construction going on, but there's a significant upgrade in terms of the transportation infrastructure. The metro system in itself, which has a behavioral impact down the road, which is reducing congestion by getting people to use public transportation, less cars on the road, less carbon emissions, but also a healthier lifestyle. That in itself is something that's been invested, not for the World Cup. It was for beyond the World Cup. The World Cup allowed for an acceleration of the project, an acceleration of the initiative, and all these initiatives now will have a life beyond the tournament.
And then beyond the state, in the region, what is the legacy for the region? I know that the role that Qatar is playing in terms of, as we just saw with the Arab Cup, welcoming Arab countries, being you know, a statement, I think, to the Arab world about, to a certain degree, the unity of the sport and how it's grown. But beyond the sport, what is the legacy of the World Cup to the region?
Look, I think, you know, what a lot of people might not know or might not be aware of is when we bid on behalf of the Arab world. I mean, when we bid, we said this is an Arab Middle Eastern tournament held in Qatar. That was always in, you know, early on during the bidding stage. I remember even meeting ministers of sports, Arab ministers of sports, even though they had nothing to do with, you know, FIFA or the decision-making process, but to gather that momentum, because it is an Arab tournament, first and foremost. For us, from the very beginning, we understood that transformative power. Again, what I said earlier, this is a platform that can do away with stereotypes, can chip away at the negative stereotypes that people have. You know, when you have fans coming in from Wales, from Scotland, from Nigeria, you know, meeting people from Germany, from Ecuador, from Peru, from Argentina, you know, you create these moments of bond, these moments of interaction. And it's these moments that all of a sudden, regardless of whatever was built in your mind previously, the minute you meet somebody else and just interact with them, you all of a sudden turn around and say, you know, that's not such a bad person. And that little spark, you know, you have to kind of invest in it, but that's a very important part. The outside world today looks at the Arab world, looks at us, and you know, unfortunately, going back to the coverage of Russia and Ukraine, you know, and I understand, you know, some of the coverage, unfortunately, in trying to get the European community to sympathize with the refugee situation in Ukraine, drew a certain kind of, you know, parallel or differentiation between our part of the world that, you know, for our side, you know, for something that's been going on for the last 10 years, it did create kind of, you know, that's how the view, you know, it created the question, is that how the world outside views us, views our people? And what we want from this tournament is to be able to do away with that negative outlook that people have from the outside world into us as the Arab world. We're a hospitable nation. We got, you know, great culture. We got great food. You definitely have to diet before you come. It's, you know, there's a lot for us to offer. Having said that as well, what I'm hoping that the World Cup also offers is for us to be able to engage with everybody else from the outside world and change that perception. That idea that, you know, people are coming to colonize us, people are coming to take over us, you know, the conspiracy theory. Because it's rampant, you know, throughout our part of the world as well. So the simple fact is to break down barriers, break down stereotypes, and it's not to push forward ideologies, it's not to push forward principles, it's to build bonds of friendship that last beyond the tournament, between the fans, between the people.
You talked about the fans. I'm going to put you on the spot. Which fans are you worried about the most in Qatar? Who do you think is going to be? And don't worry, I know there's some representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs right now.
I'm looking at a lot of friends, you know, raising their hands. So can the camera come towards you so I don't have to say it? No. Like, I mean, I think, you know, we're not.
There's definitely one or two countries I know you're worried about them. So.
Well, let me put it this way, right? We're ready to welcome the world. We're ready to welcome everybody. We're engaging with all the fans, you know, and we're, you know, it's going to be a fantastic tournament, and for the simple reasons because it's a compact World Cup. Everybody's going to be able to integrate.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to be engaging a lot more in certain parts of the world to, you know, communicate with the fan group a little bit more intently.
Well, let me see if I can ask it a different way, which is, what keeps you up at night as you approach the World Cup? What are you worried the most about?
Hey man, it's become, look, before COVID, I never thought the global pandemic would be it. After COVID, I never thought that, you know, a geopolitical or a war in Europe would. So I don't want to tempt fate.
Did you have that on your bingo card?
No, that's the thing. I don't want to tempt fate.
World War III.
I really don't want to tempt fate by saying this. But other than saying this, look, I think, you know, the way I answer it is everything and anything, and at the same time, nothing. Our plans are in place. We're moving ahead. You know, we had the Arab Cup as our test event. There's a lot of things that, you know, we learned from it. There's a lot of things that need to be fixed. There's a lot of things that need to be upgraded. So, of course, you know, we don't have a test event after that. So we want to make sure that everything that we've done during the Arab Cup or the lessons learned in the Arab Cup are being implemented. We're talking about transportation. We're talking about, for example, the fan ID, which is now the Hayya card, which was issued, you know, making sure that there's no technical glitches coming out of that, because in the end it's all technology, and it's front-facing technology, so you want to make sure that the system is in place, it doesn't glitch, and so on. And of course, you know, just making sure that the operational plans have been upgraded from the Arab Cup in the lead up to the World Cup.
And do you think that given the time frame, I mean, first of all, let me ask you, do you have like a countdown clock on your phone?
Just like that one over there, but much more intimidating.
Do you have an alarm for the first day of the World Cup on your iPhone right now? Do you have like a...
No, I don't. What I'll tell you is this, what I do have, you know, the countdown clock when it was, you know, when it was triple digits in terms of months, everything was fine. When it started going double digits, it started getting scary. And now that it's single digits, you know, I'm trying to find a place to hide.
So you're not going to hide in Qatar. Everybody knows where you are. Let me just tell you, everybody knows who you are. Everybody knows what you're doing at all times.
Well, I'm looking for some friends to, you know, to hide me when I visit.
Let's talk really quickly about what you learned from the Arab Cup. And I think the big question, I think, on a lot of people's mind is capacity. You're talking about construction. We see it around. Obviously, Qatar has the capacity to do it. The concern is, will there be enough accommodations for the 1 million plus fans that are expected to come to Qatar to attend at least through the first 2 rounds of the World Cup?
Yes, I mean, and again, it's always the question that gets asked. So just to clarify to everybody, so what we've done within the Supreme Committee and as a government, we've taken up to about 130,000 rooms, ranging from hotels, apartments, villas, cruise ships, fan villages, and so on. So that all comes to about 130,000 rooms. And the reason we took that on board in terms of our own platform and took over, if you will, that itinerary, is to give priority to ticket holders and to try to make sure that property owners don't jack up the price, because we've seen it in previous tournaments. It's a lesson learned. A lot of people, when they come towards, you know, booking, the tickets sometimes come closer to the tournament. What ends up happening is accommodation prices go up the roof. And so what we wanted to do, again, as part of our commitment that this is an accessible, affordable tournament, is offer that level of, or that itinerary for the public. So it ranges from, you know, from $80 accommodations, and it builds up according, you know, depending on the kind of accommodation that we've got available. There is accommodation as well, of course, available outside in the private sector. That we have no control over the pricing. That is the private sector. They price it as they see fit. But again, the reason right now people might be concerned about the accommodation is because it's just been released into the platform. And the reason it was done is we wanted to do it at the same time as tickets, and we give priority to ticket holders to book first their accommodation. As we start feeding or filling the demand for the ticket holders, then we'll move towards the wider public as well.
And I know this is a question that you have been asked about. It is something that is always on the mind of people here in terms of the progress both the Supreme Committee as well as the state is making on labor rights and those involved in the construction of venues, not just for the World Cup, but generally. I want you to comment on that a little bit, because it always seems to be something that, again, is brought up. Some of it rightfully so, perhaps some of it exaggerated, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, thank you. Let me say this, when we bid, we knew the spotlight that was going to come. And again, we bid with understanding very well that this is a tournament that if utilized in the right way, it will accelerate a lot of the initiatives and commitments of the state. The state of Qatar, when it launched its 2030 vision in 2008, under one of its pillars, social development and human development, had worker welfare reforms on its plans. Of course, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of issues that happen, in terms of efficiently and effectively implementing the legal system. That was an issue that was undergoing. We knew the World Cup would help catalyze and work as an accelerant for these reforms. Now, since then, we started off in a place that I think nobody can be proud of. There was a lot to be done. I'm very proud to say that today, and this is not me saying it, this is partners that at a point in time stood across the table from us as adversaries, whether we're talking about the trade unions, International Trade Union Confederation, if we're talking about the Builders and Woodworkers International, or if we're talking about, for example, the UN bodies like the International Labour Organization, that has recognized the significant steps that have been made in Qatar when it comes to labor reforms, the abolition of the kafala system, the implementation of minimum wage, non-discriminatory minimum wage, which is the first of its kind in the region, which means regardless of your nationality, so no longer minimum wage is dictated by bilateral agreements. It is now in the legal system, and it's being reviewed in terms of increasing it in the years to come. Within the Supreme Committee, the initiatives that we've undertaken, I'm very proud to say that even our most ardent of critics, whether we're looking at, for example, NGOs like Amnesty International, has referenced our standards as being the legacy or the standards that should be implemented not only in Qatar but in the region as well, for a long-lasting legacy. So the work that we've been doing within the Supreme Committee itself is being recognized by the most ardent of critics. And I'll say this very plain and simple, just in conclusion. In terms of labor reforms, everybody talks about legacy for tournaments and events after the event. And everybody plans for legacy after the event. We are delivering legacy before the event. And we've delivered legacy, and we've worked very hard towards delivering, legacy, or the legacy of this tournament 12 years into the tournament. 6 months into it, I will say this. I'm very proud of where we're at. The work is not done yet. A lot more needs to be done. And again, I don't think any nation can take the claim that all the work is done. But where we're at today, I have to say I'm very, very proud of the work that we've done.
I know we just have time for one last question. It's been 12 years. What would you advise a country that is thinking about bidding for the World Cup? What would you from what you've learned, would you advise countries that?
I was hoping to gather all this experience and actually open up a consultancy.
Oh yeah.
And get paid for this advice. But
we're going to tell you, you're going to give it free right now.
Well, I'm going to give it free right now, but there's some, I'm going to give you my 99 techniques. I'm going to keep one in the pocket.
World Cup bidding for dummies is the name of the book.
No, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that these tournaments, entering into this, it has to be a bigger play. It can't be just to host a tournament, just for the sake of hosting the tournament. Look, everybody's passionate about the event, but there's got to be a bigger play. There's got to be a bigger objective. And that bigger objective has to be a part of the country's objective. You got to identify early on. I mean, that's what we did. We took the 2030 national vision. We saw the 4 pillars. We worked with the government. The urban development plans that we had, we never imposed the World Cup requirements on it. The metro system was never imposed for the World Cup. It was something that the country was planning to build, and we worked within to make sure that the World Cup requirements complemented and at some time accelerated some of these initiatives, infrastructure-wise or development-wise, and I think that's fundamental. Because, and I'll just this is the one statement, the closing statement that I'll say, you see a lot of major events today, a lot of cities back away from major events, especially if you look at the Olympics. A lot of cities, the people don't want to necessarily host these events if you hold a referendum. And I think one of the reasons is because people don't see necessarily the benefit that comes out of these events. If you're only hosting it purely for an infrastructure project, if you're hosting it only purely for the passion of the event, then I think you're bound to fail. But if you're hosting it with a bigger play, a bigger plan, and a developmental plan, then I think these events really do help.
Are you going to tell us where you're going to go on vacation the day after the World Cup is over?
Absolutely not.
All right.
I'm going to be hiding. Actually, I'm going to be coming to your place. I'm going to come to your farm.
You're more than welcome to. Anyway, ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Hassan Thawadi. Thank you so much, Hassan.
Thank you very much, Hassan Thawadi, for giving us this insight into where the preparations for the World Cup stand, and for giving us as well an insight into diplomacy, the art of diplomacy, and how to dodge all the tough questions. I hope we can stay in touch. I promise I won't ask you who the worst fans are. And thank you, Ayman, for being relentless as always. Thank you all very much indeed for being here with us today as we conclude day one of the 20th edition of the Doha Forum. See you all back here tomorrow for what we hope will be another fascinating day of discussions and dialogue. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. See you then.